Picture this. It's the pre-dawn darkness of June 8th, 793 years after Christ. The monastery at Lindisfarne burns against the North Sea sky, orange flames licking at stone walls that have stood for generations. Monks flee in absolute terror across the rocky shoreline, their sandaled feet slipping on wet stones as they clutch sacred manuscripts to their chests. But here's what should make your blood run cold. They're not running from gleaming swords wielded by warrior princes. They're not fleeing from the legendary steel of Damascus or the perfectly balanced blades of Roman smiths. No, they're running from axes. Simple, everyday axes that look more suited to splitting firewood than splitting skulls. This is the paradox that's about to reshape European warfare for the next 3 centuries. And it starts with a question that should haunt every military historian. How did the most primitive weapons in Europe become the most feared? Let me take you back 400 years before Lindisfarne, deep into the forests of Germania, where the shadows are long and the Roman Empire's reach grows thin. Here, the grandson of Arminius, yes, the same Arminius who orchestrated the massacre at Teutoburg Forest, watches Roman legionaries march past in their perfect formations. Look at them through his eyes for a moment. They're magnificent, aren't they? Those bronze helmets catching the filtered sunlight, their segmented armor gleaming like the scales of some metallic dragon, and those gladii hanging at their sides, those beautiful, expensive swords that mark them as civilization's chosen warriors. But this Germanic farmer's grandson, he hefts his grandfather's axe in his calloused hands, the same axe that cleared the forest for his family's farm, the same axe that built their longhouse beam by beam, and yes, the same axe that had tasted Roman blood in the dark groves of Teutoburg. There's something almost sacred about that continuity, isn't there? One tool, multiple purposes, passed down through generations like a deadly inheritance. Now, I want you to understand something about Scandinavia in this period, something that Romans, with their abundant Spanish silver and their trade routes stretching to India, could never truly grasp. In the boglands of Denmark, in the frozen fjords of Norway, in the endless forests of Sweden, iron isn't just expensive. It's scarcer than gold. Every single ounce of this precious metal must serve multiple purposes, or your family doesn't survive the winter. Think about the economics for a moment. One Roman gladius contains enough iron to forge 20 axes. 20. While Frankish nobles are hoarding steel in their treasuries, commissioning ceremonial blades they'll never dirty with actual combat, Norse farmers are sharpening the same axes that fell trees to fell enemies. There's a brutal efficiency to it that should terrify anyone who believes warfare is about pageantry and noble birth. Let me introduce you to Ulf the Smith, working his forge in a village whose name history has forgotten, sometime around 750 years after Christ. His furnace barely reaches the heat necessary for proper steel, nothing like the advanced techniques they're using in Damascus or Constantinople. He cannot, despite his considerable skill, forge swords that match the legendary quality of Middle Eastern steel. The technology simply isn't available to him. But here's where genius emerges from limitation. Ulf can create something better, something the sophisticated smiths of the Byzantine Empire, for all their advanced techniques, would never think to attempt because they're too focused on perfecting what already exists. His design becomes known as the bearded axe, named for its hooked lower blade that extends like a wise man's beard. But this isn't aesthetics, this is physics, being applied to the art of killing. That hook catches shield rims, yanks them aside with mechanical advantage that no sword can match, exposing the soft flesh beneath mail and leather. It's brilliant in its simplicity, terrifying in its effectiveness. Watch young Bjorn in the clearing behind his family's farm as his father demonstrates the ancient movements. The old man's body flows like water, every motion purposeful and refined by decades of practice. The same swing that splits oak logs for the winter's firewood delivers death with mathematical precision. The wrist rotation that prevents the axe from binding in wood prevents enemies from predicting strike angles. Every subtle shift in stance, every adjustment of grip, serves dual purposes. And here's the secret that European nobles will never understand, not until it's far too late. Every farm boy in Scandinavia learns these movements from childhood. Every potential warrior already possesses 20 years of muscle memory before he ever sets foot on his first longship. While noble sons are learning elaborate sword forms in castle courtyards, Viking boys are developing the same deadly skills by helping their fathers with daily chores. This is the secret that will echo across European battlefields for centuries. Viking axes don't succeed despite being tools. They succeed because they are tools. They're not trying to be something they're not. They're not aspiring to aristocratic pretensions or ceremonial purposes. They're honest weapons forged from honest necessity, wielded by men who understand that survival trumps style every single time. The Roman legionary marching through Germania sees a barbarian with a crude axe and feels superior. He sees civilization conquering primitivism, technology defeating savagery. What he doesn't see, what he can't see, is that he's looking at the future of European warfare. He's looking at the weapon that will drive his empire's descendants to their knees, force them to rebuild their castles, revolutionize their tactics, and ultimately transform their entire understanding of what makes a warrior effective. Because in just a few short decades, these primitive axes are going to teach Europe a lesson written in blood and iron, that innovation beats tradition, that skill conquers expense, and that sometimes the humblest tool makes the deadliest weapon. The monastery at Lindisfarne is still burning, the monks are still running, and somewhere in the darkness, Viking axes are being cleaned of English blood, ready for the next raid, the next victory, the next chapter in a story that will rewrite the military history of an entire continent. But how did these simple tools become instruments of such terror? How did farmers' axes evolve into weapons that could shatter shield walls and humble the finest warriors Europe could produce? That transformation begins with blood, innovation, and a master smith whose name will echo through the halls of Valhalla. 790 years after Christ brings revolution to Norse smithies, and it starts with a man whose grandfather's name will become legendary among weapon makers, Master Ulfbert. Now, before you dismiss this as just another blacksmith story, understand that what happens in his forge is going to change the face of European warfare forever. Picture Ulfbert's grandfather hunched over his anvil, sparks flying like tiny stars in the darkness of his workshop. He's not trying to copy anyone else's design. He's solving a problem that's been plaguing Viking warriors for generations. The traditional axe, while effective, has limitations. It's front-heavy, which means exhaustion sets in quickly during prolonged combat. The cutting edge, while sharp, offers only one angle of attack, and perhaps most critically, it can't manipulate an enemy's defenses the way a skilled warrior needs. So he perfects what history will call the bearded axe. And that extended lower cutting edge that resembles a wise man's beard. That's not decoration, folks. That's physics being weaponized. Think about this, for a moment. The beard shifts the weapon's center of balance forward, multiplying striking force through leverage while keeping the overall weight minimal. It's the same principle that makes a crowbar so effective. You're not just swinging dead weight, you're applying mechanical advantage. A warrior can fight all day without the crushing fatigue that comes from wielding heavier weapons. But here's where it gets really interesting. That extended edge creates a hook that completely transforms battlefield dynamics. Let me paint you a picture of how this played out in real time. The summer of 832 after Christ. 12 Saxon chroniclers will remember it bitterly as the Summer of Axes, though they mean it as mockery. They have no idea they're witnessing military history being written in blood. 5 separate Saxon armies are about to learn why innovation beats tradition, and they're going to learn it the hard way. At the River Tyne in Northumbria, 800 Viking raiders find themselves facing 2,400 Saxon sword warriors. By every conventional measure, this should be a massacre of the Vikings. 3-to-1 odds, defending on home territory, equipped with the finest steel Saxon smiths can produce. The Saxons form their traditional shield wall, overlapping shields, creating an impenetrable barrier, swords ready to thrust through gaps. It's a formation that's worked for centuries, refined through countless battles, proven against every enemy they've ever faced. They're confident, and why shouldn't they be? They've got superior numbers, superior position, and weapons that cost more than most Vikings see in a lifetime. But they've never faced bearded axes used by men who understand their true potential. The Viking assault begins with something the Saxons have never seen before: volleys of hand axes thrown with devastating accuracy. But here's the crucial detail: they're not throwing to kill, they're throwing to embed those axes deep in Saxon shields, making them too heavy to hold effectively. Think about the physics. A 2-pound axe buried in your shield suddenly makes that shield weigh twice as much. Your arm starts shaking, your formations start wavering, and that's when the real slaughter begins. As Saxon shields drop from sheer exhaustion, the bearded axes come into their own. Those hooks catch shield rims and simply yank them away entirely. Picture it. You're a Saxon warrior, your expensive sword ready, your mail gleaming, your training perfect, and suddenly your shield is gone, torn from your grasp by a tool that looks like it should be chopping firewood. The naked shield wall becomes exactly what it sounds like: a line of exposed men waiting to die. The psychological impact is devastating. These aren't just defeats, they're demonstrations of military obsolescence. 4 more battles follow the same pattern that summer, each one reinforcing the lesson. The old ways of warfare are dying, and the Vikings are writing the new rules with their primitive axes. But the true test comes in 866, when York, one of the greatest cities in England, falls to what chroniclers describe as impossible odds. 3,000 axe warriors meet 8,000 defenders in a battle that becomes a masterclass in applied physics versus traditional tactics. Leading this assault are the most feared names in Viking history: Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless, whose tactical genius compensates for his physical limitations; Bjorn Ironside, whose presence on any battlefield means certain victory; and Sigurd Snake-Eye, whose gaze alone is said to paralyze enemies with fear. Their axes bear names like warriors bear names: Legbiter, Mail-Piercer, Widowmaker. These aren't just weapons, they're extensions of their owners' souls, forged with the same care other men reserve for their children. The battle becomes a study in the superiority of practical engineering over aristocratic tradition. Saxon sword warriors, raised from birth with expensive steel, trained in elaborate techniques passed down through generations of noble families, find themselves completely unable to adapt. Their muscle memory, honed through decades of practice, becomes their weakness when faced with unfamiliar angles of attack. Here's why. Swords require specific angles to penetrate mail armor effectively. There are optimal striking points, precise techniques for finding gaps in ring mail, elaborate maneuvers designed to overcome defensive armor. It's beautiful, really, like a deadly dance performed by masters of their craft. Axes? Axes concentrate all their force on a single point and punch through ring mail like it's parchment. No finesse required, no elaborate technique needed, just devastating, concentrated force applied exactly where it needs to go. The Northumbrian nobility, with their centuries of refined swordwork, watch their lifetime of training become irrelevant in a matter of hours. Far away in Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor himself watches a demonstration that proves why these primitive warriors have become the most sought-after mercenaries in the known world. His Varangian Guard, Norse axe warriors paid in Byzantine gold, are about to show him why emperors prefer them to native troops who've trained their entire lives with conventional weapons. A mounted knight charges their formation in a training exercise, his lance leveled, his armor gleaming, his horse thundering across the ground like an earthquake with legs. It's an impressive sight, the flower of Byzantine cavalry, the pride of their military tradition, the culmination of centuries of tactical development. One Varangian steps forward, just one. He times his swing with the precision of a master craftsman, and his axe takes the horse's front legs in a single, devastating blow. As knight and mount tumble in a chaos of steel and screaming, another axe splits the fallen, knight's helmet like an overripe fruit. The emperor nods his approval. Gold well spent, indeed. These aren't isolated incidents, folks. These are proof of concept demonstrations that a revolution in warfare is underway. The expensive, elaborate, aristocratic traditions of European combat are being systematically dismantled by men with tools, But this is just the beginning. Because what happens next, 15 specific battles where primitive axes humiliate civilized swords, is going to build a legend that terrorizes an entire continent and forces every kingdom in Europe to completely rethink everything they thought they knew about warfare. The bearded axe has been born in blood and innovation. Now comes the time for it to prove its worth against the finest warriors Europe can produce. Between 850 and 1066 years after Christ, chroniclers across Europe are forced to record something that challenges everything they thought they knew about: warfare. 15 major battles where primitive axes systematically humiliated civilized swords. Each victory builds the legend, spreads the terror, and refines the tactics that are reshaping the military landscape of an entire continent. But these aren't just Viking victories. These are lessons in military innovation that force every kingdom in Europe to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the student surpasses the master, and sometimes the most advanced military thinking comes from the most unexpected places. Let's start with Brunanburh, 937 years after Christ. Constantine of Scotland and Olaf of Dublin have formed an alliance that should terrify any English king, 18,000 seasoned warriors marching against Athelstan's forces. The numbers alone should guarantee victory, but numbers mean nothing when you're fighting in the wrong century with the wrong tactics. The battle takes place in a narrow valley, where the expensive cavalry advantage that English nobles depend upon simply disappears. Horses become liabilities in confined spaces, and suddenly those beautiful, expensive war horses are just very large targets. This is where Viking axes excel. In close quarters, where traditional swords need room to swing, axes can strike from impossible angles. A Northumbrian poem, written by a survivor who watched his entire world change in a single afternoon, describes axes drinking sword blood as they splinter shields, shatter helmets, and cleave through mail-clad shoulders like farmers reaping grain. Eric Bloodaxe, EI, and yes, that's his real name, not some later embellishment, earns his terrifying reputation here, his axe sending arcs of crimson across the morning sky with each perfectly timed swing. But it's the poetry of that description that should chill you, drinking sword blood. The weapons themselves have become mythical, credited with an almost supernatural thirst for violence. That's not just military victory, that's psychological warfare on a civilizational level. Move forward to Paris, 885 years after Christ. Count Odo stands on his walls, watching an army approach that shouldn't exist according to everything he's been taught about military logistics. Vikings have sailed up the Seine, sailed their longships hundreds of miles inland to reach the heart of Frankish power. The logistics alone should be impossible, but here they are. Their leader, a giant of a man called Rollo, yes, the same Rollo who will become the first Duke of Normandy, carries an axe that requires 2 hands to wield effectively. As Parisians jeer from their supposedly impregnable walls, feeling safe behind stone and mortar, the Viking warriors begin a demonstration that will haunt French nightmares for generations. Axes spin in perfect synchronization, catching sunlight, creating a whirling wall of steel that hypnotizes observers with its deadly beauty. Then comes the throwing demonstration that shatters French confidence completely. Hand axes embed in wooden gates from distances that should be impossible. Each throw precise enough to hit specific targets marked on the wood. The psychological message is crystal clear. Walls offer no sanctuary from flying death. These aren't just weapons, they're instruments of terror wielded by men who've turned violence into an art form. The siege lasts months, but Paris never recovers its confidence. Even after the Vikings leave, Parisians flinch at the sound of metal striking wood. But perhaps the most famous single combat in Viking history occurs at Malden, 991 years after Christ. As English forces retreat across the causeway, desperate to escape the slaughter behind them, one Viking blocks their path. Just one man, standing alone against an entire army. His axe swings in figure-8 patterns, creating an impenetrable defense that no English weapon can breach. For 3 hours to 3 hours. He holds that bridge alone while his brothers plunder behind him. Think about the stamina required. the technical skill, the absolute confidence in your weapon and your ability. 40 English sword warriors fall before this nameless Viking, each one convinced they can be the hero who breaks through, each one learning too late that heroism means nothing against superior technique. His end comes not from sword work but from cunning. A boy with a spear crawls beneath the bridge, thrusting upward through the planks. But even dying, even with a spear through his body, the Viking's last act is to hurl his axe into the English ranks. It splits a nobleman from crown to chest, proving that Viking weapons remain deadly even in death. The chroniclers don't even record his name. To them, he's just another barbarian, but to military historians, he represents something profound. The moment when individual skill with innovative weapons proved superior to traditional tactics backed by superior numbers. The ultimate demonstration comes at Stamford Bridge in 1066, a date that should echo in every military academy in the world. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, brings 15,000 warriors to claim what he believes is rightfully his, the throne of England. His personal axe, named Hel, after the Norse goddess of death, measures 5 feet in length and requires a man of extraordinary strength just to lift effectively. Picture the battle's climax: an English knight in full mail, the finest armour Frankish smiths can produce, representing centuries of metallurgical advancement, charges the king. This knight embodies everything European military tradition holds sacred: noble birth, expensive equipment, lifetime training, mounted advantage. He's the perfect warrior according to everything European culture teaches about warfare. Harold's swing catches him at the neck joint where mail meets helmet. The axe continues its arc through mail, flesh, and bone, nearly severing the man in half. Witnesses say the sound, metal parting, bones breaking, life ending, echoes across the entire battlefield like a thunderclap announcing the end of an era. English morale doesn't just break, it shatters like the knight's armour. They're not just witnessing military defeat, they're watching their entire understanding of warfare become obsolete in real time. But here's what makes these 15 victories truly revolutionary. They're not flukes or lucky breaks. They represent systematic advantages that primitive weapons hold over advanced ones when wielded by men who understand their true potential. Each battle reinforces the same lessons. Innovation beats tradition, practical skill conquers expensive equipment, and sometimes the humblest tools make the deadliest weapons. European chroniclers struggle to explain what they're witnessing. How do expensive swords lose to cheap axes? How do trained nobles fall to Viking farmers? How does civilization lose to barbarism? They can't accept the obvious answer, that their assumptions about military superiority are completely wrong. These victories force a complete re-evaluation of European military thinking. Within a generation, the lessons learned from Viking axes will transform everything from weapon design to castle architecture to battlefield tactics. The humble tool has forced an entire continent to evolve or die. But evolution takes time, and while Europe struggles to adapt, Viking axes continue their reign of terror. The 15 victories have established a new reality. In the hands of men who understand their potential, these primitive weapons are the most advanced military technology on Earth. The question isn't whether European warfare will change, it's whether it can change fast enough to survive what's coming next. Stamford Bridge marks the sunset of the Viking Age, but for the axe's influence on European warfare, that's just the dawn. Within a single generation, the lessons written in blood across 15 battlefields force a complete transformation of military thinking from the Scottish Highlands to the Italian peninsula. Watch this evolution happen in real time. English Huscarls, those elite warriors who survived the Viking onslaught, begin adopting Danish axes as their primary weapons. These are the same men who once mocked Viking primitiveness. Now they're abandoning centuries of sword tradition because they've learned through bitter experience that effectiveness trumps elegance every single time. Scottish gallowglass warriors' perfect axe techniques learned from Norse settlers in the Hebrides, combining Highland ferocity with Scandinavian innovation. Even French knights, gnomes paragons of sword nobility, those living symbols of aristocratic military tradition, begin carrying battle axes as secondary weapons. The humble tool that European nobles once dismissed as barbaric has forced military evolution across an entire continent. But the changes go deeper than just weapons. Castle design itself transforms to counter axe warfare, and the economic impact is staggering. Traditional shield walls, the backbone of European military doctrine for centuries, prove hopelessly vulnerable to hooking attacks. So fortifications must emphasize elevation and distance, keeping axe warriors far enough away that their devastating close-quarters advantages become irrelevant. Arrow slits narrow dramatically after Vikings demonstrate that thrown axes can penetrate existing defensive openings. Gate designs incorporate massive metal reinforcement after too many wooden barriers prove meaningless against determined axemen. One economic historian calculates that European kingdoms spent more gold on anti-Viking fortifications than Vikings ever stole in 3 centuries of raiding. Think about that. The mere threat of these weapons cost more than the actual damage they inflicted. In 1200 years after Christ, a French military manual appears that should terrify anyone who understands military psychology. It advises knights, against the Danish axe, usual sword work fails completely. One must strike and retreat quickly, never binding blades, never allowing the hook to catch shield or sword. The manual's very existence proves the lasting trauma of Viking victories. 4 generations after Stamford Bridge, French military instructors are still teaching techniques specifically designed to counter weapons their grandfathers faced. European martial arts have permanently incorporated anti-axe defensive methods because the terror of those 15 victories has become institutionalized knowledge passed down through military academies. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. The axe's deepest legacy runs through Scandinavian cultural DNA like a river of steel. Even today, Norwegian weddings feature ceremonial axe exchanges between families, acknowledging the tool that built their civilization. Swedish forests echo with the sounds of axe-throwing competitions that descend directly from Viking warrior training. Finnish lumber workers take pride in techniques that are literally 1,000 years old, passed down through generations of men who understood that an axe in skilled hands can accomplish anything. The democratic ideal that emerges from this, that skill matters more than birthright, that a farmer with an axe can equal a noble with a sword, shapes Nordic society's egalitarian values in ways that persist to this day. When Norwegian oil workers or Swedish engineers approach problems with practical innovation rather than traditional hierarchy, they're channeling the same mindset that made Viking axes so devastatingly effective. This philosophy travels wherever Scandinavians go. In American forests, Norwegian and Swedish immigrants become legendary lumberjacks, their inherited axe techniques creating the Paul Bunyan myths that define frontier culture. Australian bushmen of Nordic descent clear impossible acreages with efficiency that amazes their neighbours, wielding axes like extensions of their own arms. The Viking warrior's tool has become the pioneer's companion, still conquering new frontiers, still proving that practical intelligence beats aristocratic assumption. Every time an American logger fells a massive tree with perfect precision, every time a Canadian woodsman shapes timber with ancestral skill, they're continuing a tradition that once terrorized Europe. But perhaps the most profound legacy is philosophical. The 15 victories taught Europe a lesson that military historians are still analyzing today. Innovation beats tradition. Skill conquers expense. And sometimes the humblest tool makes the deadliest weapon. Vikings didn't use axes because they couldn't afford swords. They used axes because axes worked better. This principle revolutionizes military thinking far beyond medieval Europe. When American revolutionaries defeat British regulars using unconventional tactics, they're applying Viking logic: work smarter, not harder. When modern special forces choose practical gear over ceremonial equipment, they're channeling the same mindset that made bearded axes so effective. When today's military innovators develop new technologies based on effectiveness rather than tradition, they're following paths first carved by Norse smiths in forgotten forges. The story of Viking axes becomes a template for military revolution. Identify what actually works, ignore what looks impressive, and never let conventional wisdom override practical results. It's a lesson that resonates through every conflict where superior technology loses to superior thinking. In the end, practical intelligence defeated aristocratic assumption. The foolish light axe had won not just 15 battles, but the war for military evolution itself. European warfare was forced to grow up, to abandon childish obsessions with expensive ceremony and embrace adult realities of effectiveness and efficiency. And somewhere in the forests of Scandinavia, master smiths still forge axes using techniques perfected in the age of longships, because the Viking legacy isn't just about conquest, FT, it's about the eternal truth that good tools, in skilled hands, can change the world. The monastery at Lindisfarne is long rebuilt. The terror of that June morning in 793 has faded into history, but the lesson remains, carved into European consciousness like runes on ancient stone. Never underestimate the power of practical innovation, and never forget that sometimes the simplest solution is the most revolutionary. The age of the Viking axe is over, but the age of Viking thinking, LT, that beautiful brutal marriage of innovation and effectiveness, CTA, that continues every time someone chooses what works over what looks impressive. And in that choice, the spirit of those ancient warriors lives on, still conquering new worlds with tools their enemies never saw coming.